On today's episode, a visual history of rock and roll and the trailblazing artist who invented it and continue to bring us this quintessential American sound. Welcome, I'm Barry Kibrick. 2 years ago, the Smithsonian put out a request for fans worldwide to send them their own photographs that go back to the earliest roots of rock and roll all the way to the present. Then they brought in my next guest, Bill Bentley, one of the most respected people in the music industry, to put it all together and add the text to the music that will never die. Bill, welcome to the show. It is a pleasure to have you here. I found this book to be just something right up my audience's alley. I can tell they're going to love it.
Thanks for having me. You know, it's funny because I watch your show all the time, and after I wrote the book, I thought, like, I've got to get in touch with him and try to get on his show, and here I am because I love the show so much.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure, and this is such an interesting, let's sum this up in a nutshell. What it is the Smithsonian, the greatest, one of the great institutions of our country. 2015, they send out this massive notice that they want the fans' pictures of rock and roll from its inception to the present. And then you, being so respected in the music industry, they ask you to come in and help put this whole thing together and, as I described, supply the text to the music of our lives.
Well, you know, it's funny when they got in touch with me. Back in the 90s, when I was a publicist for a record label, there was a band called the Flaming Lips. And they were kind of a outre band. I mean, they were out there, and I was their publicist. And their tour manager, years later, 25 years later, became the marketing director of Smithsonian Books. And we'd known each other. So he called me out of the blue and asked me to do this book. And I just went like, you know, I'd been at a record label for so many years, and I wanted to expand what I was doing. And he said, do you want to do this? I said, now, let's get going.
Well, you know, and what's interesting, too, is it really, there's no doubt there's a majority of the icons of rock and roll, and those are the ones we are going to speak about, and we're never going to get through them all. There's no way. There's over almost 150 of them in here. But what we'll have our fun, and the viewers will get to see the fans' photos as we're talking. So I think that's going to be a real neat experience from a fan's perspective. So what I found is that, I'm going to just use your words because I think they're so great. Rock and roll didn't save our lives as much as make them. And that's what this is, how the music affected the lives of the people.
Well, you know, I was very young when I first heard rock and roll. I think I was 5 years old when I heard Hound Dog by Elvis Presley for the first time. So it wasn't like, you know, things had gone south in my life. I mean, I was 5 years old. But from that day on, everything that I did and hoped for and kind of dreamed of was centered around the music that I heard and loved. I mean, I just got possessed by it almost in like an otherworldly way. And that's what I meant when I said they made our lives. My decisions were made from listening to songs. My career path, you know, I would get involved in things that I thought I could be close to the music. I tried to be a drummer. I was mediocre at best. So I figured I better find another way to make a living being next to the music. And I got into publicity and writing.
And Elvis, of course, starts the book off, at least as one of the first stories we talk about here. And you say the reason is because he was the first one to literally cross over the old genres. He was the one that they had enough rhythm and blues in him, had enough country in him, had enough folk in him, had enough everything that when he got on, and even though rock and roll came a little before him, so to speak, he was the one that brought it to the world's attention.
And think of his stage presence. I mean, when Elvis, it was like, I call it the neutron bomb. When he went on Ed Sullivan in October of '56, that's sort of the definition of when the country found out about rock and roll. And, you know, to his credit, a lot of people hated it and made him the poster boy to hate for, like, this is the music that's going to destroy our civilization. So he had it both ways. He was the icon of all the kids loved him, but then the establishment, you know, wanted to string him up. And they tried to, until he joined the Army and saved himself.
Well, you know, the other thing is that you say, and it's arguably that although he was that first, many of the critics say it was Chuck Berry that really sort of gave that rock and roll its bite.
Right. Well, too, and that's why I start the book. The very first picture in the book is a picture of Chuck Berry in 1957 doing an in-store at a record store with elementary school kids in Waco, Texas, who had not really probably ever been around an African-American person other than in a subservient position. And that's part of my theory, too, is that rock and roll really was a prime catalyst for integration, because it brought white people in touch with African Americans in a way that they could look up to them and really try to understand the music that they were writing. I mean, if you think of Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf and Jimmy Reed and a lot of the early blues guys, that's what all the great English bands loved that made them want to play rock and roll. So in a weird way, the African American music of America went to England, into the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, brought it back to America, and exploded rock and roll all over again. It really made it. I mean, those were the years with those bands that made it like the mega music of all time, around the world.
We'll get into them all. No, wait, I'm not saying we're not going to get into half of them even.
Right.
But what I like, though, is that you show us the good boys and the bad boys, and you label them such, and women as well. And one of the first bad boys is Jerry Lee Lewis, and you say this man was incapable of compromise.
Absolutely. If he saw something that looked normal, he'd put a match to it. He was just, I mean, I worked with him for a few years as his publicist. He was the rebel of all rebels. And I think part of it was his background when he was a child and just being brought up in Faraday, Louisiana, where there was so much wildness. And there's just something in his soul that couldn't behave. He really couldn't. He was incapable of it. He still is.
But you know what? There is, and you credit it to Fats Domino. And the part of rock and roll that I've always loved is the happiness of it. And you credit that with Fats Domino. You say Fats brought the happiness to rock and roll because it really did originate out of the blues and out of that, Southern African experience as well. And though Fats may have come from there, he saw the happiness and joy in the music.
Well, he was also the kind of man in New Orleans, he'd found a lifestyle that just let him be who he was. He didn't have to pretend anything. And a lot of times, he never really learned to read and write or drive or anything, but he just existed on a plane. I used to see him and I'd go like, he sings with a smile. You didn't sense this real angst at his soul like the blues guys had. They were trying to get out of a terrible situation, from slavery on. But Fats just came across, he was just a kind of a happy-go-lucky guy that knew he was the luckiest guy in the world because he was huge.
Now you talk about soul. I just put the two notes down here, Ray Charles and James Brown. And we all know James Brown is the godfather of soul. And yet the words you used for Ray Charles was he built bridges.
Yes.
And I think that's some of what you intimated before of bringing the colors together.
Yes, because he came out of a style of music, he started listening to jazz when he was young, great piano player, and then he, of course, was very influenced by church music and blues. So he kind of put all those three things together in this real jubilant style of music that just brought people's spirits up. And that's why they say he was a father of soul, because that's what soul music is. It's church, blues, and rock and roll all put together. And that was his invention.
But the godfather is still James Brown, because he then took that now and gave, just like Elvis did, the performance level to it. That's, you see, there's two levels that this plays on. It plays on the heart and soul and the performance.
Always. One of the luckiest days of my life, I was 13 years old, living in Houston, Texas, and my older brother was going to an African-American nightclub that night to see James Brown, 1963. And I talked to my mom and made her tell my brother he had to take me too. So in 1963, I went to a club to see James Brown, and that might have changed my life more than anything, because you saw that experience, that live experience with him up close at that age. To this day, I still can't believe what I felt. It was amazing.
Now, okay, but now let's go, if he's the godfather, then the godmother has to be Aretha Franklin.
Oh, yeah.
And not always do you, by the way, there are people in here, and we'll get to some of them, including Aretha Franklin, you don't always associate her with rock and roll as
Right.
much as you do with soul, but because they are so tied together, they're in the fans' version of the book, because for fans, she
They are.
exudes the same thing.
And think of the influence that she had on rock and roll singers. I mean, when she first hit in 65, 66, she'd been a gospel singer as a child. Her dad was a preacher. She tried to be a jazz artist at her first label, but by the time she started making these soul records, it was like rock and roll people were looking for someone like that. Like, I don't think Janis Joplin would have been the singer she became without being influenced by Aretha Franklin. And some of the people in the book are, people say, well, they're not rock and roll, but they influence rock and roll so much, I felt like they had to be in it. You had to have Al Green in this book.
In fact, Janis, even though Elvis is first, there's a picture of Janis even before Elvis in the book.
That's right. That's right. She was hell on wheels when she was a kid in Texas in the 50s, and went to Austin and was a folk singer and a blues singer and finally made her way to San Francisco. But she'd been trying to sing music for 10 years before anybody ever heard her. And she just couldn't get heard. So it was almost like a fluke of nature that she ended up in San Francisco in a rock band that allowed her to explode. Rock and roll is really a series of happy accidents, the way people get famous. I mean, I've worked with so many singers that didn't get famous because that accident didn't happen for them.
Isn't that it?
I know, it's kind of heartbreaking. But
It is.
It's like life itself. You have to have this, I always tell artists, you have to have a perseverance and stick with it.
And you know what? I remember having this discussion about Bruce, which I'm going to bring up Springsteen because he's my hometown boy.
All right.
And someone said, a guy like Bruce would be playing rock and roll if he only did play in the Stone Pony bar in Asbury Park, and that's all he ever did. Because that's all. So it is the twist of fate that may make you famous, but it's what's in your heart and soul that comes out.
If you don't have that passion continually, you're not going to make it. You have to have that, just the ability to go like, no matter what, I'm going to keep doing this.
We mentioned that the birth of this is really the R&B, the rhythm and blues, and you say that the person behind that, ground zero, is B.B. King.
Yes, because B.B., is known as a blues singer, but if you listen to the sophistication of what he did, he brought in the horns, he brought in the swing, and he put all that with just really kind of gut bucket blues and elevated it to a very complicated music, which helped rock and roll singers see that the blues could swing. And that's what B.B. brought to it. And plus just the passion of his voice. When you heard B.B. sing, you believed it.
Passion, talk about passion of voice. And here's again where we go with a country artist originally, Johnny Cash.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he's in here again for his influence, and mostly, in my opinion, if you listen to his last two albums, man, first of all, he's covering a lot of rock and roll, and he's doing it. When you hear him do that 9 Inch Nails song, I believe it's that song, Hurt.
Yeah. It's all one thing.
I mean, it just rips you. I don't know how, it rips a hole in you, just like the lines go.
And Cash was at the end of his life, and I think he knew he was at the end of his life, so he just went to this place that you probably don't get to go to unless you know it's pretty much over, and convey that sense of finality in a way that a lot of music talks about, but Cash was living it at the time, and then he passed away not long after that.
Let's go back to the happiness a little bit. And the happiness, again, comes, in my opinion, so often out of the beautiful harmonies. And the Everly Brothers, and then later on Simon and Garfunkel, but the Everly Brothers, they set the standard. Your words, I think they're just so beautiful. An extraterrestrial union of their voices.
That's right.
And you can, this day, you just pop every song almost when you go, what is that song? If you can't remember it, but you know it, it's the Everly Brothers.
That's right. Well, a lot of that, I think, comes from the DNA they share. In a way, brothers or sisters can sing together in a way that a lot of people can't. And then just the way they created those harmonies, I think that's at the very bedrock of what the Beatles did. I think the Beatles listened to R&B when they were starting, obviously, but then they also adapted that to put on the incredible harmonies of the Everly Brothers into what they were doing, and that's why they exploded, because it was irresistible. The harmonies and the beat, it's all over.
And that's what I'm always attracted to as well. I came up with my own tagline here. And I call this the poets. Now, I want to make it very clear. Virtually every person who's writing music is a great poet,
Yes.
especially those that have achieved it. But I have a few of them that are my personal favorites, and I want to discuss them a little bit. First, actually not my favorite, but first that you can't deny as the poet laureate of rock and roll is Bob Dylan.
Yes, yes. Well, he approached words, I think, from really reading books, a lot of deep books, and he had the mind that could distill the essence of the great American novels into a verse. And that takes a real, almost, I don't like to use the word genius much, but for Bob Dylan, I think it does apply.
Oh,
but
yeah.
He could take books
Definitely.
and bring it down to just being a 3-minute song. And very few people could do that, especially at the time. Folk music had great lyrics, but they didn't have always that just 3D depth that Bob Dylan could get in even his earliest songs.
Now, I said it wasn't, I love Bob Dylan, but my favorite still, and one whose words I use and quote. That's another thing why I put them under the poet. When you can quote
Yes.
their words over and over again, that's a
Yes.
little different than just being able to sing them, but use them as quotes. And that is Leonard Cohen.
Yes.
And you use these words, and I think they describe him so well. A calling card for all that beats within the human heart. And you're especially referring to his song, Hallelujah, which
Yeah.
I think might be now the most covered song in history, or if not one
Probably.
of them. Maybe White Christmas is the most covered song,
Yeah.
but it's something like that. It has to be.
It really is. And the interesting thing about Cohen, I think, even young, he had an old soul. So he was speaking to the ages almost from his very first songs, and love in a way that was so grown up. I remember listening to his first album in the 60s, and I thought at the time, I'm not old enough for this. This is like kind of beyond me in a way. But as you get older and you really sensed like what he was talking about, it takes your breath away.
But you know something? Again, we're going to bring back that joy. We're going to ferry cross the Mersey,
Oh,
as
right.
they say. The Beatles, the Mersey was that great river that separates London and Liverpool. They crossed that river
Right.
from Liverpool into London, and then from London into the world, and a phenomena that has never been duplicated
Will
or
never be.
before, and I can't imagine ever being. Yeah.
Well, think of the Beatles. You know, they come out of England, which had parts of England had almost been bombed to death. It was bleak, you know, and they were people that were born during the war. They were young, but their lives had to be so bleak. And it's like everything in life. You reach out to something that helps you get beyond the bleakness. And what they reached out to and found was American music. And it changed everything.
And like Elvis, which was the phenomena before them,
That's right.
They had, like Jerry Lee Lewis and Chuck Berry, the bad boys, then come the Rolling Stones,
God.
and they're the bad boy version of the Beatles. Although, I must tell you, I've heard some very early Stones, very early, before they even came to America, and they almost sounded a lot more sweeter and mellower than the Beatles. So they must have made a transformation to become those bad boys.
I think they were so intrigued with like Howling Wolf and those real gnarly blues guys that just to this day almost scare you when they listen to them. They were so deep into that sort of colored their music in a scarier way than the Beatles.
And then you have our American version of what came after that invasion, and you end up with the Beach Boys and the Mamas and the Papas, the California sound now, not only a national sound, but now a state sound, the Beach Boys and the Mamas and the Papas.
Well, think of their influences. They're out here, Southern California. They go to the beach. They live in sunshine almost every day of the year. The economy's good in the 50s and 60s. I mean, you know, post-war, it was great here. And I think they didn't have that sense of desperation to go there where the Beatles and those bands did. So in a way, their music was a happier, sunnier music. It made sense. That's where they were coming from.
Now, we talked about the pain and the early tragedies, and you can't escape the man that truly made the guitar what it is, Jimi Hendrix. Now, here again, you see, I think they all died just about the same year in their lives, not the same year, but in their lives, in that 27, 28, 29-year-old range. And Jimi, he took that guitar, and now the guitar becomes the centerpiece of rock and roll.
Well, he took it in some ways, I think, almost as far as you could take it at the time. And maybe in a sense, Hendrix kind of knew that and didn't know where else he could go, because I know in the last year of his life, he was looking for new ways to express himself. And I think he was hitting some dead ends. And he probably got into a frame of mind where like even he was confused what more he could do with it. But I mean, for those 3 or 4 years where he really took it to the limit, I don't think it will ever be. It's sort of like Charlie Parker did on the alto sax with jazz and bebop. In a way, I don't think Hendrix will ever be overtaken for really being innovative with the electric guitar.
2 personal favorites, both named Tom. I'm going to hit you with Tom Waits and then Tom Petty. And we all know Tom Petty. Now, he just passed so sadly. It ripped my heart out. But Tom Waits, as you say, he lived at the corner, I'm going to read your words, of Heartbreak Boulevard and Lonely Avenue.
True.
And I hear that voice, and like the Dylan voice, that rasp, that growl, that whatever that is, and it just penetrates my soul.
Yeah. He captured that despair that is in the lower classes of like bohemian life. You know, he lived it too. I mean, I know his friends, it wasn't something he made up. They were living pretty much on the street. I mean, they weren't winos, but they were living lives that weren't comfortable. And I think Waits had the soul of a poet as well, and kind of married that low-down life with the loftiness of what he was thinking about in a way that very few people have ever been able to do, ever.
And then I go to Tom Petty, and such a range of music. It's unbelievable. But yet, again, when I say you can quote them, all you've got to do is say the waiting is the hardest part. And he sums up basically life for everyone with those simple words. The waiting is the hardest part.
I think for Tom Petty, rock and roll was really his life preserver. I mean, I read a little about his early life. He was sort of a lost kid in Florida when he was growing up. And once he found rock and roll, he knew that this was his way out of that life. And one thing I will say about him, he respected music and other musicians probably more than any artist I ever knew. He really believed in spreading the word on other people besides himself. You know, a lot of artists get wrapped up in themselves, but Petty was the kind of guy, his radio show, he would talk constantly about music you've never heard of, saying, you have to hear this.
Oh.
This is it.
And then bringing people together, the traveling Wilburys.
Yeah.
Just for the record, they're not in the book because but in my opinion, as far as what we'll call superstar groups, they are the greatest superstar group. And I swear, all you have to do, if you're ever feeling blue, listen to the Wilbury song, The End of the Line.
Right.
And you can't listen to the Wilburys, The End of the Line, and not feel that you're not in total despair, that you're not going to come out of this, that you're not going to feel better. And that's what a lot of the good music really does.
Well, you know, I was at Warner's when the Wilburys got together, and you could just tell it was this like almost like nuclear reaction of upness, because they'd all been superstars for so long, but when they were together, they were just 4 normal guys playing. And that takes such a load off of the kind of lives they sometimes have to live when they get that big, which is isolated. But they were just having fun. And it reminded them why they started doing this in the first place.
Now, I said I can't end with, otherwise every single one of my friends are going to kill me. I'm a Jersey boy, and not only am I a Jersey boy, but we went to the same regional high school, me and Bruce. He was there before me, but I'll never forget seeing him at Rutgers in a place called The Ledge. It was during freshman orientation, and only 200 people were hanging around at this time. And I walk in, and right away you know that you are looking at the next biggest thing to ever hit the stage. And within 1 year, this guy is everywhere. But then it was just playing at freshman orientation.
That's funny. I learned a very valuable lesson from Bruce Springsteen. When he came to Austin for the first time, his second album, the E Street Shuffle, had just come out, and he played 2 nights at a place called the Armadillo. The first night, it held about 1,000 people. The first night, about 200 people were there. You know, it wasn't shabby, but it was definitely not even half full. And the word went out in Austin overnight. The next night, you couldn't buy a ticket to get in. Everybody that was there called somebody and goes like, you have to see this guy.
That's how we
It was so true, man.
I'm going to end with these words. They're yours. No one knew in the 50s where rock and roll would end up, and now 60 years later, it's still going strong, and still no one knows where or what it will turn into. Bill, you brought rock and roll to our lives.
Always,
thank you so much, buddy. A pleasure.
My pleasure.
And thank you guys for joining us. Now, before Bill leaves, I'd like to leave you with these few more words from the Smithsonian's Rock and Roll Live and Unseen. And by the way, before I do, there's so many people from Michael Jackson. I know everybody's saying, you didn't mention Michael Jackson, you didn't mention David Bowie. We're going to have to talk about them at another time. We just ran out. So I'm going to still end with Bill's words. No matter what the powers that be predict, those plugged into the divine power of rock and roll sense that not all its hands have been played. That's the beauty of the music. The surprise is always waiting out there somewhere. And when it hits, we'll all be shaking. I'm Barry Kibrick. Between the rock and the roll is the beauty of the music. So keep on shaking. Thank you, Bill.
Man, my pleasure.
My pleasure. This was beautiful.
To connect with Barry, like him on Facebook and follow him on Twitter at Barry Kibrick. And to contact Barry directly, view past episodes of Between the Lines, and read his weekly blog, visit us at barrykibrick.com.